dictator of Geneva. And he goes on to say this: to achieve his draconian suppression of personality, to achieve his vandal expropriation of the individual in favor of the community, Calvin had a method all his own. The famous church discipline. A harsher curb upon human impulses and desires has hardly been devised by and imposed upon man down to our own days. From the first hour of his dictatorship, this brilliant organizer herded his flock, his congregation, within a barbed wire entanglement of paragraphs and prohibitions, the so-called ecclesiastical ordinances. Simultaneously, creating a special department to supervise the work of this terrorist morality. This organization was called the Consistory. These are lies, damnable lies, slanders against a faithful servant of God who sought only that the church and the lives of its members would be ordered according to the Word of God, and that impenitent sinners would be excommunicated from the fellowship of the church. Like Ezra and Nehemiah of old, Calvin and the other reformers brought God's people back from their Babylonian captivity in the Roman Catholic Church. But the restoration of God's people to the Jerusalem of his truth and the rebuilding of the temple of his right worship was one thing. The preservation of both of these required also the rebuilding of the wall around the city for their protection, for their defense. That wall was the wall of Christian discipline. And Calvin expended himself in the rebuilding of that wall. Consider with me this afternoon Calvin's struggle for church discipline. Calvin's struggle for church discipline. Let's notice three things together. First of all, a brief recounting of Calvin's struggles over church discipline in Geneva. Secondly, the main features of the church discipline for which Calvin struggled. And then finally, our calling today to preserve this aspect of our Calvin heritage. From one point of view, Calvin's entire ministry in Geneva can be viewed as his struggle for the recovery of biblical church discipline. It was really with a view to the organization of the church and the reestablishment of church discipline, recognizing his own inabilities in this area, that William Farel first persuaded Calvin to take up his ministry in Geneva. It was August of 1536. John Calvin was 27 years old, barely. The city of Geneva at that time had a population of nearly 10,000 people. By the standards of the day, it was a large and prosperous city. Prior to this, prior to Calvin's coming to Geneva, the city had committed to the cause of the Protestant Reformation and had expelled the Roman Catholic clergy. William Farel, the leader of Geneva's company of pastors, recognized in the young Calvin the God-endowed gifts that were desperately needed in the Reformed Church of Geneva. From the beginning of Calvin's first stay in Geneva, the issue of church discipline was a contentious issue. It was contentious among the people, many of whom were not willing to have their lives ordered by the discipline of the church. Many of them were glad to be rid of Rome, and for this reason had supported the decision to become a Protestant city. But they resisted the application of the principles of the Reformation to the ordering of the church, at least to the ordering of their lives. But especially were the efforts of Calvin and Farel resisted by the Genevan magistrates, the two main ruling councils of the city. It was because of their steadfast insistence on church discipline that barely a year and a half after beginning his work in Geneva, Calvin and Farel were banished from the city. This was April of 1538. After his banishment, Calvin, for 3 years, lived in Strasbourg. It was a 3-year respite from the struggles in Geneva. It was an enjoyable 3 years as Calvin pastored the French refugee congregation in Strasbourg. It was a very productive period in Calvin's life, but it was also a time of preparation. For God used Calvin's stay in Strasbourg as his preparation of Calvin to resume the work in Geneva, especially this work, the work of church discipline. I think it's altogether proper to look at Calvin's first stay in Geneva as God's exposure of Calvin to the issues. Calvin must be made aware of the difficulties and the problems. And his stay in Strasbourg is God's preparing him to go back and deal with those problems. The leading reformer in Strasbourg was Martin Bucer. He had prevailed upon Calvin to come to Strasbourg. Bucer was a leading proponent of biblical church discipline. And it was Bucer who influenced Calvin greatly and whose views, by and large, Calvin adopted. Bucer's fundamental position is expressed in this statement of his: there cannot be a church without church discipline.